Hey, welcome to today's review of the brand new ASUS TUF A17, which in this configuration comes with the new Ryzen 7 7735HS, which is basically the same CPU as last year's Ryzen 7 6800H, with the only difference being the 50 MHz faster core clock, as well as an NVIDIA RTX 4050 in a 140 watt configuration, which unfortunately seems to be unable to use more than around 95 to 105 watt, which is a problem that we're going to talk about later. Furthermore, in this configuration we are getting 16 GB of DDR5 RAM with 4800 MHz, a 17-inch IPS screen with 144 Hz and Gsync, and unfortunately only 512 GB of SSD disk space, which can be expanded with a second M.2 since the laptop offers a second M.2 slot. PS, there is also an all AMD version of this ASUS TUF A17, which comes with the AMD RX 7600S with 8 GB of VRAM instead of an RTX card. But we're going to focus a bit more on the RTX 4050 version in this review. But in the future I will record some videos where I compare the 7600S with the newest NVIDIA mobile GPUs, so make sure to hit that subscribe button to get notified once these are published. Now back to the review. The build quality of the laptop is pretty decent. The full plastic body feels valuable. It has a total height of 2.5 cm when closed and weighs 2.6 kilograms. It's pretty good in preventing fingerprints, and the display lid is pretty stiff. It has a pretty obvious gamerish design, especially considering the look of the RGB lid keys. It actually looks like previous ASUS TUF laptops, and the design is definitely military inspired. It seems to be identical to last year's model in terms of the design and build quality. The laptop actually comes with a real ASUS TUF backpack. As far as I know, that is supposed to depend on the region you live in and is not guaranteed. So you should check that up front if it's important to you. The quality of the backpack seems to be okay. If I would buy this in the free market, I would guess it has a worth of around $25 to $30. Well, as of the release of this video, the ASUS TUF A17 in this configuration costs around $1,400 or 1,550 in euro. This price should drop quite fast, as it is definitely too high for a 50 card series. Though other countries might come with slightly different hardware, like 32 GB of RAM instead of 16 GB and a different i7, and you can also get this with 1 TB of SSD space. The all AMD RX 7600S version is supposed to be a bit cheaper, but otherwise it's basically the same laptop. The 144 Hz full HD display offers Gsync, and I measured a maximum brightness of only 265 nits, which is not bright enough to use it outside or next to a window on a bright day. The measured color accuracy unfortunately isn't the best, with 66% sRGB, 48% NTSC, and a 50% coverage of the Adobe RGB color space. Let me make clear that you won't notice this as a regular user, and of course you still can use creative apps like Photoshop or Premiere Pro if you're not a professional that is bound to color accuracy for customers. It is a very standard display that entry-level gaming laptops usually have. Nothing fancy, but most users won't mind, to be honest. Of course, it would be nice if they started using screens that at least have better brightness. The response time is pretty slow, with 25 milliseconds though, which you might notice if you're very sensitive. I didn't, to be honest. PS, you can easily open the display lid with one hand, which is nice. And the laptop wakes up within 1 to 2 seconds from sleep mode. The keyboard has a real RGB functionality, but only one RGB zone, and you cannot assign separate colors for each key. It comes with a real numpad and highlighted WASD keys, which give it a visible gamerish look. Writing felt firm and comfortable. It's basically the same keyboard as on my personal ASUS TUF A15 from 2020, so I'm very familiar with how it feels. There is almost no keyboard flex. The touchpad is pretty neat, it's very slick, and it has a satisfying clicking sound. By the way, this is what the integrated camera looks like and the integrated microphone sounds like. Now, considering the connections, the laptop offers a total of 2 USB-A ports, and both of them are USB 3, as well as 2 USB-C ports, of which one of them is a brand new USB 4 port. Both of these USB-C ports have DisplayPort compatibility. Combined with the HDMI 2.1 port, you can attach at least 2 external monitors at the same time. Furthermore, it offers a LAN port and a 3.5mm audio jack, so the connectivity is pretty up to date. And all of the connections except one of the USB-A ports are on the left side of the laptop, which is the way it's supposed to be.
This is the way.
You can actually charge the laptop via USB-C with up to 100 watt. So using a traveling charger would actually work, but you won't get the laptop's full gaming power when you do that. The speakers are definitely one of the weakest aspects, if not the weakest aspect of this laptop. They have literally no bass and the loudness is disappointing since they sound cheap. Really, really cheap. If you are planning to buy this laptop, I recommend using headphones of any kind. Well, my personal laptop right now is, as I said before, ASUS TUF A15, and it has the same terrible speakers, so that's that. The ASUS TUF Armoury Crate and the My ASUS software allow you to tinker around a lot and set fan speeds as well as the RGB lighting of the keyboard to your liking. They also include the mux switch and many more options. When the fans are at maximum speed using the manual mode and the laptop is on a laptop stand running Cinebench, resulted in a maximum temperature of around 88 degrees Celsius for the CPU with neither power or thermal throttling, resulting in a boost clock of 4.2 GHz. In that scenario, the CPU is able to draw a constant 80 watt over an infinite time, which is quite a lot. The Cinebench score didn't really drop even after 30 minutes of running it constantly, which is pretty uncommon as most laptops I've tested have a noticeable drop in the score after a while, but more about that later. Not using the laptop stand results in around 90 to 91 degrees, by the way. At full speed, in the manual mode, the fans are really, really loud. Using the turbo mode, then they are still pretty loud. But if you're using the regular performance mode, the loudness is actually pretty okay considering the performance. And on silent mode is almost unhearable while still providing a good performance. And in this chart, you can see the difference between these modes in Cyberpunk 2077 and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Turbo mode keeps the components a bit cooler, but it is unreasonably loud. Me personally, I would prefer using the performance mode or even the silent mode if I'm getting enough FPS anyways, because it really is remarkably silent. On idle, the laptop can turn completely silent, and thanks to its really big battery, that makes it actually suitable for school, university or the library if you're willing to carry around a 17-inch laptop, if it just had a backpack delivered with it. Overall, the cooling system seems to be okay-ish, though it can get very loud. The GPU temperatures are alright when gaming, as you can see here. The new AMD Ryzen CPUs are designed to go pretty high as far as I'm aware, so 85 degrees Celsius isn't a problem at all. The laptop surface actually stays pretty cool while gaming. It never felt too warm or uncomfortable. The Ryzen 7 7735HS isn't the fastest CPU ASUS could have used for this laptop, but it is a fast processor nonetheless, and it should be absolutely sufficient for years to come. It is boarding 8 cores and 16 threads. It's actually almost identical to last year's Ryzen 7 6800H, with the only difference being a 50 MHz high boost clock as I said before, but it's still a Zen 3 Plus CPU. Its overall performance is pretty comparable to Intel's i7 12650H, especially in work-related tasks. In games, the Intel is a bit upfront thanks to its fastest single-core speed. In Cinebench, using the performance mode, it reached a pretty high maximum of up to 14,254 points in the multi-core test and 1,559 points in the single-core test, where recent Intel mobile CPUs are definitely a bit faster. Using the regular performance mode, the multi-core score was still around 13,739 points in the first run. As mentioned before, the Cinebench results barely drop 100 points even after 30 minutes of constant benchmarking. In PC Mark X, it got a high score of 7,061 points in performance mode and still 4,825 points on battery using the silent mode. In the ASSD benchmark, the built-in 512GB Micron PCI Express Gen 4 SSD was reaching solid sequential reading speeds of around 3,400 megabytes per second and rather disappointing writing speeds of only 1,369 megabytes per second when the drive was around half filled, which is not a lot in 2023. The laptop offers a second M.2 PCI Gen 4 slot. PS, the RAM is also upgradable or exchangeable easily. By the way, using an external Innertech case for M.2 SSD, I was able to achieve pretty high reading and writing speeds thanks to the USB 4 port as well. The big 90 Wh battery in this laptop is really satisfying. Thanks to the Ryzen, the laptop manages to throttle its total power usage down to very low 5 Watt on idle. So on idle with 20% display brightness and activated Wi-Fi, I saw a fantastic runtime of around 17.2 hours. Watching YouTube with 50% brightness using headphones, it achieved around 7 to 8 hours. And gaming without capping the FPS on battery ended after a pretty long 60 to 80 minutes, whereas even demanding 3D titles are actually playable really well, which is very uncommon for such a big gaming laptop. So I was actually testing the brand new Atomic Heart on medium settings on battery, which resulted in a very high FPS in a runtime of approximately 17 minutes. In a Plague Tale Requiem, I was using low settings and capping the FPS at 30, which extended the runtime to almost 2 hours. And playing a light game like Civilization 5 and a 60 FPS cap resulted in a runtime of 3 to 4 hours. I was really surprised to see that this laptop seems to be designed in a way that allows you to play on battery. So the big 90 Wh battery makes a lot of sense. Oh, and I was using the silent mode when testing these games on battery. The laptop offers a battery conservation mode, which stops charging the battery at 80%. There is also a quick 100% load mode, which allows the laptop to quickly charge the laptop from 80 to 100%, and after unplugging it and then plugging it in again, it will stop loading at 80% again. So that's a nice feature if you're using the conservation mode all the time but need the laptop to be mobile spontaneously, in my opinion. PS, when plugged in, the laptop would pull around 150 to 180 Watt from the wall on the full gaming load, which is no problem for the included 240 Watt PSU. The gaming performance is pretty identical to other RTX 4050 laptops. I made a dedicated video on the gaming performance of this GPU using an MSI Katana. If you're interested in that, I will link to it over here and in the description, as well as within the end card of this video, so you can check it out afterwards. I won't make another video for the ASUS TUF as it is mostly identical, with some games being a bit faster and others being a bit slower. But I have to point out that this laptop did not have any frame time issues that I've had with all the MSI laptops that I've tested. The dedicated RTX 4050 is a brand new entry-level GPU by Nvidia, and it is the first 50 series mobile card to offer 6GB of VRAM, which is finally acceptable for Full HD gaming, at least for a while. The laptop offers a MUX switch, which didn't seem to have a big effect on the gaming performance. It was activated through all my testing though. Overall, it is safe to say that you can play any existing video game as of the making of this video, with at least 60 FPS on this laptop. Thanks to Nvidia's frame generation technology, newer titles that support DLSS 3.0 can provide a noticeable extra boost if this tool is activated. I really started to like the feature, and it didn't seem to have any visual problems except for some in-game menus that sometimes produce weird artifacts if frame generation is on. And me personally, I didn't feel the additional input lag that frame generation can cause, but I'm not the youngest anymore, so what do I know? Right? As mentioned before, I have to point out that the RTX 4050 never reaches the full 140 Watt while gaming. Well, that doesn't mean it's slower as it should be. It can reach the full potential of the GPU in most games. But this is a bigger topic that I actually discussed in a separate video, which you can watch over here, and I will also link to it in the description. And now we're going to have a quick look at the performance in some games. However, in a nutshell, don't worry about the wattage in this case.
Okay, so I was testing 5 new games on the ASUS TUF A17, also using the frame generation feature where available, because I really do like that one. I actually noticed that using this feature and DLSS in combination is causing the GPU to draw even less power than the 85 Watt. I guess that is because the game then becomes more CPU intensive and the GPU does not need to run at 100% since it is not calculating these extra images in the traditional way. But let me know in the comments if you have a different theory about that. All following games have been tested at 1080p, by the way. Oh, and this laptop would absolutely deliver enough power for gaming on WQHD, also known as 1440p to some extent. You might need to tinker around with the settings in most games to make sure you won't exceed the 6GB VRAM though. The same applies to 4K, whereas here you might not be able to play newer games in a satisfying way, but all the titles should definitely work. Okay, so the first title I've tested was Call of Duty Warzone 2.0 using the balanced preset at 1080p with DLSS quality and saw an average of around 92 FPS with a 1% low of 58 FPS. It felt absolutely fluid and playable. You could definitely achieve a few more FPS by using lower settings or stronger DLSS options. As you can see, the GPU power draw is at an insanely low 55 to 60 watt with a usage of only 60 to 70%, while the CPU is able to use a relatively high 45 to 50 watt, maintaining a high clock speed of 4400 MHz. This is definitely caused by DLSS and frame generation. Frame times seemed alright though. I was testing Cyberpunk 2077 using the high preset combined with DLSS quality and frame generation once more, which again resulted in a low power draw of the GPU. I saw an amazingly high average FPS of 103. 103 FPS on a so-called entry-level gaming GPU on high settings is insane considering how the game performed 2 years ago, even on higher-end desktop hardware. Thanks to DLSS and frame generation, the 4050 is able to achieve a lot more than what, for example, a desktop 1080 Ti could achieve. The 1% low FPS were alright as well, with around 53 FPS, which often were caused by hiccups when entering a new area for the first time, so I'm assuming that in longer gaming sessions they would almost completely disappear. As you can see, the FPS don't even drop when driving around in crowded areas, which is usually the case. PS, I tried to kind of feel the difference of the game's input lag with frame generation and without, and I didn't notice any, even though I'm sure you can measure it with high FPS cameras and such. I was actually testing the beta for Diablo 4 on the highest settings without DLSS and saw an average of 131 FPS and a 1% low of 51. I mean, it's just a beta version, but it's obvious that it would be playable perfectly no matter what. I'm pretty sure you could even do so in WQHD and 4K if you adjust some settings, so the VRAM limitation won't become a problem. Surely in higher levels and more monsters at the same time, the FPS would go down a bit, but I'm like 100% sure it won't ever be a real problem. In Hogwarts Legacy, I was once more using frame generation and DLSS on quality on high settings and saw a very high average of around 110 FPS and still some pretty low 1% FPS of around 32, but the frame time graph was pretty flat most of the time. The hiccups and stutterings are usually caused when an area is visited for the first time or you get some random frame drops that the game just has. So playing for a longer time would have probably helped a bit. There are also some tweaks that you can follow to improve the performance of the game even more, but in some systems there's still just frame drops nonetheless. PS, the game did have more issues on the MSI Katana 15 and the MSI Thin with the RTX 4050. I was eager to see how Red Dead Redemption 2 would work, since that title was very problematic on the MSI laptops as well, as it would stutter all the time with heavy frame time spikes. Back then I was almost calling it unplayable. I did not have any of these issues on the ASUS TUF, so I actually think that the tiny 96-bit memory bus the RTX 4050 Mobile has was not the problem in all these tests. It was just the MSI laptops for some reason. So using high settings with DLSS quality, I was seeing a very good average of 75 FPS and a 1% low of around 41 FPS. Perfectly playable.
In Blender, I was comparing the NVIDIA RTX 4050 Mobile of this laptop with the RTX 4060 and the Katana 17 and the RTX 2060 of my personal ASUS TUF A15. As you can see in all tests, the 4050 and the 4060 are relatively close together with a noticeable distance to the RTX 2060. Using Blender with the RTX 4050 is absolutely possible, but you will have some issues when you're trying to render very big composings, as the VRAM will be too small. But in that case, you could always use the CPU to render, which would take longer, but it will use the bigger regular RAM of your laptop. In the Puget Systems benchmark for Premiere Pro 2023, the ASUS TUF A17 scored a total of respectable 789 points. Well, overall, I would say that for a price of $1,300 or less, this laptop would actually start to make sense. I actually had a really good time testing it. The build quality is good, the battery capacity is very good, and the performance is great, even in the more silent modes. It's mostly the bad speakers and the disappointing screen that stood out negatively, and the rather small 512GB SSD in this configuration, but you could easily do something about that as SSD prices are very low these days. The fact that it comes in a big box with a nice laptop backpack is a nice bonus for sure. The good CPU, GPU and SSD make it super fast and responsive, even for heavier tasks. Also, the good keyboard and overall build quality are pluses. But compared to last year's 3060 laptops, it's most certainly too expensive in the beginning. So if you're watching this in mid or late 2023 or later, that might have changed already. So make sure to check the current price before making up your mind. I would actually consider calling this a very mobile laptop that would also make sense for a day at school or university, while still being a real gaming laptop for sure. Okay, so that's all for today. If you enjoyed the content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more laptop reviews and mobile GPU tests and other PC stuff as well. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye bye and tschüss.